Hi, welcome to episode 2 of Dead Times, the only horror movie podcast that I host. And with me always is the only person whose prom invitation I would not consider a malicious prank, Tim. How you doing, Tim?
I'm doing just fine. Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be talking about Carrie from 1976, I believe. Um, so what were your initial impressions of Carrie?
Um, my initial impressions were nervous laughter at myself for getting as fucked up by the ending as I did.
Yeah, that ending
Uh,
is classic and one of the most important endings basically in all of film because that's the origin of sort of the jump scare ending. Uh,
yeah, yeah, and it's so like in a way it's so incongruous with the rest of the movie, and like I was initially like I was we're getting way ahead of ourselves here, but I was puzzling over like is this cheap? I feel like this is sort of a cheat compared because the rest of the movie is such a slow burn.
mhm.
Um, then to suddenly get a jolt out of you right when you're all emotional at the end. I was like, this isn't fair. Um, but on reflection, I think it works, and I think it's still thematically congruous with the rest of the movie.
Yeah, I think
No, I,
that
I liked it a lot. I thought it was I thought it was very effective. And it's funny. Last week we were talking about or last week to you listeners, we were talking about how Godzilla um, can be sort of considered more of a horror film than a lot of other films like it, a lot of other kaiju movies and a lot of other Godzilla movies. Um, Whereas this one, and this isn't the first time I've thought this about a King adaptation, I think is in some ways not a horror movie. Um, or at least it's not a pure horror movie in a way. And like in a way, I think Gojira is closer to that because so much of it is it's got so much intent behind its storytelling besides getting a scare out of you, which isn't unique
mhm.
isn't unique at all. But something about the way that it approaches a lot of its elements um, strike me um, as being part of a different approach.
Yeah, well, I
So
think
I think that was really cool.
with this movie in particular, the horror doesn't start until an hour and 15 minutes into it, and it's only an hour and 38 minutes something long. Um, and your only indication that you're in a horror movie is the scary sound effects when Carrie's using her telekinesis.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
and the thing about yeah, and the thing about this particular movie is that um much like Godzilla, its biggest influence wasn't on horror, even though obviously had a huge influence on horror. Like its biggest influence was on teen comedies. And
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of this weird proto clueless. It's like if Heather's wasn't a comedy, you know,
yeah,
um,
the movie that I think
or like Freaks and Geeks or something.
the movie that I think takes the most from Carrie is I believe it's She's All That, which is the movie about the like guy taking a bet to see if he can make anyone prom queen.
Right?
Like,
Yeah,
like I think that those sort of storytelling troops, like the all the teen comedies that focus on the prom and on who's going to be king and queen of the prom, I think that's all sort of directly descended from Carrie.
yeah. It's just none of them end even remotely the same way.
Yeah,
Um,
and like I think that if you walked into Carrie not knowing this is a horror movie, and having no clue about that end or about what happens at that hour and 15-minute mark, like you could see this going in a very different direction where
yeah, yeah.
where
Like
it's
this is
like
just
she's going to be triumphant, and I kind of think she is triumphant.
Yeah,
but it
there's
just
argument to be had there.
mhm.
Um, yeah, it's like yeah, for most of it, it's just sort of a slightly more R-rated version of Matilda. Um,
Mhm.
and then it takes a swerve.
Yeah,
But at the same time, it's not a gimmick. It's not like From Dusk Till Dawn,
yeah,
where it's supposed to be really jarring and incongruous because that's kind of the joke is that, halfway through the movie, it's like, oh, suddenly we're going to do this. Like it still feels natural. It still totally makes sense with the rest of the movie you saw. It's just at the same time, it's a bit of an escalation as far as
yeah.
as far.
And I think that's sort of very much to the movie's credit,
Oh yeah,
um, because the thing about it is that like it takes stuff that we wouldn't normally consider horror and then sort of applies a sheen of horror to it. Because this is a movie about bullying long before we got very, very sensitive about bullying. Um,
yeah. And
and like
case
it's
you're in case you're not sensitive to it, it makes sure that you get it.
yeah, because
Like it goes.
I don't
Wow.
think anyone in the 70s was as concerned about bullying as we are today. Well, I'm certain there were people, but
Brian
um,
Brian De Palma apparently being one of them.
yeah. Um, but it was obviously not sort of the cultural touchstone that we were um, sort of dealing with today. And again, I think I'm not going to say necessarily that our attitudes today are descended from Carrie, but I definitely think that sort of in the 80s when there were all those comedies about like the nerds versus the popular students are directly descended from sort of what Carrie set up and what
Yeah.
Carrie's sort of point of view was. Um,
Yeah, which is sort of troubling in retrospect because if you take out the supernatural elements, what you're left with is a movie about a school shooting, is what it
yeah,
is.
yeah, it
Um,
was very,
it's the same narrative that we see, whenever that happens. It was always the quiet kids, always the ones that were picked on, always the ones that were made to feel like nothing, and in a desperate claim for agency, ended up hurting or killing some of their peers.
yeah, um,
It's the same thing, and it's the same sort of psychological progression. Um, which is weirdly prescient because it wasn't really a big thing. This was still 20, 30 years before Columbine, right?
yeah,
So it was a long time.
yeah.
Um,
Like, and that's sort of, which again we talked about with Godzilla, how movies sort of become fade in and out of relevancy. Like, this was definitely a movie that became way more relevant post Columbine than it was sort of before Columbine. Like, and
yeah.
particularly because of the fact that do you find Carrie to be a sympathetic character?
Do I?
Yes,
Um, uh, that's a loaded question.
it is a loaded question. Although I can say I find her to be very sympathetic.
In an objective sense, she is. She is. Um, she's written as a sympathetic character, and as I mean, you're sympathetic to her plight. Obviously you don't want to condone all of her actions, but you understand them, and you understand that it's not really her fault that she ended up the way she was, because this is a kid who, by the end, is really clearly not all there,
yeah,
and you know exactly why that is. So it's hard to it's definitely hard to say that she's evil, or that she's not malicious at
yeah,
all, but she's
yeah. Well, I
um
think that one of the things that the movie, which obviously it's based on a Stephen King book, and the book did this as well, and one of the more brilliant aspects of it is that she doesn't have an oasis. Like, there's no place where she's secure.
No.
because she comes from a very abusive home, and then she goes to school where she's constantly abused. And like she, again, up until the end, she seems like kind of a very, very sweet and very nice girl who um, just kind of wants someone, some human support.
Yeah, and there are people who try to give it to her. There's the gym teacher,
Hmm.
and there's the guy with the Roger Daltrey hair.
Sue Snell and Tommy Ross.
That's the guy. Yeah.
Mhm.
All three of them, none of them are perfect, but all three of them do really seem to have Carrie's best interests at heart.
Mhm.
Um, and um, they're notably the ones who are the least present in the finale. Sue runs away, Tommy is knocked out, um, and 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 the gym teacher meets her fate.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's funny. This is the argument I keep having to make to my family about Catcher in the Rye, because I'm the only person who likes that book in my household. Um, 'cause, and, all my other siblings and my parents hate it, and they hate it for the same reasons a lot of people hate it, because like the main character is so unlikable and is so is so narcissistic and kind of mean. And the argument I always make to them is, no, that's the point, because you get these glimpses throughout that book of what a sensitive and caring person this could be. That he has
Mhm.
these moments of, he has this compassion for his sister, or he'll, have this sort of innocent concern about ducks starving to death because the pond is frozen over. And the point that the book is trying to make is that this is what this kind of society, in that case, the society of the 50s, does to people, is that it forces people who would otherwise be very sensitive and compassionate human beings to to become these very kind of self-centered and often harmful individuals, almost as a defense mechanism. And that the point of the book is that tragedy, that this is not a book about a good person. It's a book about a person who could be good if circumstances were different. And what terrible circumstances have we created where that's ever true of anybody? And I think the same is true for Carrie, that Carrie's actions in the end are not justifiable. She's a murderer,
Mhm.
but the point of the movie isn't, look out, scary murderer. It's, look what we do to this kind of person.
Mhm.
When we marginalize people this way, that it's the blame for who created the monster is squarely on the other characters in the movie.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that the
Carrie's just sort of a mirror. Carrie is sort of, it's all of the aggression that was shown towards her throughout her life just suddenly bouncing back out of her. She hardly seems in control of it.
yeah, I think that the most evocative image, even more so than sort of Carrie wreathed by flames, is when we see her standing in the window, and then right around that window is Carrie White eats shit. Um,
Yeah.
which it's something no one. There's a background extra cleaning it up, but no one in the scene, including Carrie, seems to even notice that it's there. But it just
Yeah,
sort of is like around this poor girl. There's just like the air, this sort of treatment of her as an object of degradation.
yeah,
Um,
it's just part of the tapestry of this whole town, apparently, that it's just baked into everything.
that
Um,
it's okay to treat her as basically garbage. Um, and that
yeah.
And part of the tragedy of it is that Sue Snell and Tommy Ross genuinely want, well, Sue genuinely wants to make up for what she did. And Tommy seems to genuinely like Carrie as a person. And part of the tragedy
Yeah,
is that because of the fact that they were trying to give Carrie, which again, up until that hour and 50-minute mark, she's having what seems to be the best night of her life.
yeah.
And they were
She
trying to
seems like
give
she
that to her.
finally found that oasis. She finally seems like she belongs somewhere.
Like, she's making friends, she's being social, she's having what seems like a genuinely fun time. And then Chris comes in and ruins it. Um, which I think we should talk. Well, let's talk about the opening. What'd you think about that?
Yeah, I wasn't really sure what to make of that long. Well, which part of the opening are we talking about? Um,
I'm talking about the entire thing, the long camera pan through the girls' locker room, followed by um, Carrie White's first period, followed by how horribly her classmates treat her for not understanding what that is.
yeah. Um, I mean, it's kind of the only way I think the movie could open because what Carrie what everything that is sort of broken inside of Carrie, and the reason that she is the way she is, and thus is the reason the way she's treated the way she um, is because of her mother, and the reason her mother is the way she is, or at least what she is she seems to be somebody who operates almost 24/7 out of uh, a driving and paralyzing fear of sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, Carrie is, more than anything else, a product of that. Um, as somebody who, was raised by somebody under the influence of that. So that sort of infects everything. That carries on top throughout the whole movie. So I think opening with that with those images, because there's sort of, you see a lot of different aspects of sexuality in that opening. There's the other girls who are running around, and lots of whom are naked and don't really seem to care, because they're teenage girls, and they're in the 70s, and there's something kind of frivolous about it. And then there's Carrie. We cut to Carrie washing herself, who's very innocent, very it's very childlike the way that she moves. There's this kind of utter naivete. Um, and then she gets her period and is frightened of it, and is immediately then horrifically bullied for being frightened of it. And then that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the movie, that this is the form of sexuality that is a presence in Carrie's life.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
it's enormously evocative. Well, I mean, obviously, blood plays a huge thematic role throughout this entire movie.
yeah,
Um, but I think it is just enormously sort of uniquely about, well, there's this aspect to femininity that she obviously has no access to. She has no idea, she has no understanding of until it actually is literally happening to her. Um, and like that's sort of how she exists throughout the entire rest of the movie, is that she doesn't understand sort of why her life is necessarily the way it is. If you, I want to put it that way, that
Yeah.
like she doesn't
Um,
have any control over these things and is sort of trying to learn about them, and then every single time that she sort of makes that step forward, um, she basically just gets slapped back down.
yeah, by
Like
somebody.
she becomes basically a woman, if you want to put it in sort of that term, and then immediately, instead of like any sort of support, helping her out, compassion, she's just immediately assaulted by a mob.
Yeah.
And like that is again very much parallel with the ending where she's once again covered in blood and being assaulted by a mob.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Um, yeah. Although, although the second time when she's covered in blood in the movie, she is not screaming about it,
No, she is not.
which
Um,
I think is a notable contrast. And it's also very notable that her telekinetic abilities don't manifest until after she gets her first period. You know,
yeah,
so uh, it what's the word I'm looking for? Um, I don't know. It's well the development of that ability is simultaneous with her um, uh, uh, adolescing and leaving girlhood behind.
hmm
Um, and so the harmful and violent use to which that's eventually put is because of the parts of her womanhood that weren't allowed to develop because of other people.
yeah. I mean, this is a coming of age story. It's a nightmarish, hellish coming of age story, but that's what it is.
Yeah,
Um,
it's sort of an aborted coming of age story. What happens when um, aside from a few people who really aren't as much help as they should be, you don't have anybody to guide you.
mhm. Like
She has no example to look up to. She can't
yeah,
she can't see herself or who she's going to become in her mother.
mhm.
Um, and I guess maybe she tries to in the gym teacher, but it doesn't. That's never really made much of.
I mean,
Um,
I think Mrs. Collins, sort of in this
yeah,
adaptation, Mrs. Desjardins in the book, like I think she tries as hard as she can to like help Carrie, but there's really not much she can do.
yeah, and she also doesn't really know how bad Carrie's situation is. Nobody
Mhm.
does,
Yeah.
because she and her mom are both quiet about it,
hmm
and um, so yeah, nobody really understands where she's coming from.
hmm
Uh, they don't. They don't. Everybody else doesn't know that this is a horror film.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, like,
that they assume. Yeah, again, they assume that this is more like one of the narratives that is descended from this movie. That
mhm.
that Carrie just needs to be coaxed out of her shell a little bit.
Yeah.
Not taken to child services
Mhm.
and having her mother arrested.
Yeah. Which, I
Um,
mean, one of the genuine horrifying moments early on in the film is when her mother just literally drags her into the closet.
yeah,
That's deeply disturbing. Um,
yeah, it's horrible to watch. It's funny. One of the things that surprised me about this movie is how how pleasant a lot of it was to watch, because there are sequences that are so deeply unpleasant to watch.
mhm.
There's the opening, there's that sequence, a lot of other sequences with her mother, but a lot of the rest of it is kind of fun, and you kind of get sucked into the high school drama.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, like, you can't help but enjoy, like, the sequence where Carrie's trying on lipstick and
yeah,
Tommy is and his friends are fiddling around with tuxes, and like it's all sort of just like happy high school, like just
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
Um,
There's even dopey montage music
mhm,
over it.
mhm.
Those were great. Um,
And like even sort of the montage of Mrs. Collins and her detention, where she's forcing them to exercise, and they're all basically terrible at it.
yeah,
Um, like just stuff like that. That's sort of
yeah. Which at the time it seems to come out of nowhere. You later learn that it does serve a purpose. That you're making it. It's making you understand to what degree um, uh, these people feel punished for what they did to Carrie. So that you understand it. But yeah, at the time, it seems like it comes out of nowhere. So what movie are we in now?
like yeah, there are just which again there are so many sequences where you're just watching a high school film and you feel like this, even though there's no way really that this story could end other than with Carrie taking a massive revenge on everyone. You feel like, oh, well, if you didn't know that that's where this was going, you would feel like, oh, well, this is sort of a high school movie and Carrie's going to be triumphant and be
Yeah,
like the glamorous prom queen, and all these bad people are going to get foiled.
yeah, which is sort of what happens.
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, that's sort of what I was getting at when I was saying that in a way this isn't really a horror movie. That it's sort of um, that it's a horror movie mixed with a high school movie in a way that I wouldn't say about I don't know the Babadook.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Babadook isn't a horror movie mixed with a drama. It's just a dramatic horror film. Like
Mm-hmm.
it all knits together very neatly in a way that this doesn't. I think to its benefit because it
Mm-hmm.
makes the more horrific parts of it stand out.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
this is also something that I felt about both adaptations of it.
mm-hmm.
That it's that neither the miniseries nor the film are uh, horror stories exactly. They're stories about childhood that involve a particularly frightening childhood monster.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of it's like if if Tom Sawyer had Cthulhu in it all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really play like just and again I'm not meaning to dismiss things that are more pure horror films. This is part of why I reach for the Babadook, because the Babadook is a film that I admire a lot, and a film that I admire a lot for its dramatic merits.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying that there's a difference between a horror film that has elements of other genres in it, or that has dramatic or thematic weight to it, because lots of them do. The one we talked about last week did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I
Um,
think, like, as I was saying, that the biggest influence Carrie had wasn't on horror. Like, there are a lot of
right.
horror movies that take place in high school. Halloween does, Scream does, and while there's some elements of Carrie throughout them, like, again, the ones that really hone in on what Carrie's messages were, what Carrie's style was, are those uh, teen comedies. Um, I
Yeah.
don't think it diminishes sort of the horror to point out that
No.
so much of this is sort of this other, or so much of it is just building a sort of teen high school world and going and building a plot based around, well, this is about high school.
Yeah. Yeah. Which thematically it is.
Hmm.
It's because because if movies have taught me anything, it's that high school is literally hell.
Yeah.
Um, which this film takes to heart.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. It's sort of even looking at the story, you could tell that story as a horror story. And I haven't read the novel, so it could be that the novel plays it more that way. But the way that it's executed, even with the all of the upsetting sequences throughout the first half of the film and the bloodbath in the finale, it plays more like a tragedy. That there's something sort of grandly wistful and, well, not wistful, but sort of, it doesn't make you want to scream. It just makes you want to weep, And I think that's what makes the more sort of mundane high school aspects of it feel more congruous, because there's this sense of normalcy that isn't being invaded exactly, which is the way that most horror films do that. Almost all horror films involve this sort of some kind of malevolent presence invading what we think of as a as a safe environment, like a shower, or a hotel room, But in this, it isn't so much that there's this horrible outside presence that is invading our nice comfy high schools. It's more that it's showing a high school, and it's laying it bare for the kind of battleground that it is, and then proceeds to let us watch it eat itself.
Yeah, well, I mean, Carrie, one of the things that makes it so unique is that Carrie is undoubtedly the protagonist of this movie. She's the point of view character. She's who we're following throughout the entire movie. And the antagonists are the people who are Chris, are her mom, are the people who are against Carrie. But yet she's also the horror element. She is the Babadook of the story. And I would struggle to think of any other. There really aren't that many others that follow this particular setup. There's a movie called Maniac that does, well, Maniac and its remake. But you are following Carrie's journey throughout this, and she is the protagonist, even if she is a villain protagonist or an unsympathetic protagonist. And I think I think there is an innate desire to want to see Carrie be triumphant in sort of a non-lethal way.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know what you do with that. Yeah, sort of what you want in a in a sort of Hollywood popcorn eating way is you want her to just in the finale you want her to just knock them around a little bit. You're still sort of with Carrie up through all that shenanigans with the fire hose. You're like, yeah, just slap them up a little bit. They deserve it. It's when people start indiscriminately dying that you have to sort of force yourself to stop siding with her.
Yeah. Well, this I believe this is the most frequently adapted Stephen King work, because there's this movie. They did a sequel to this movie like 2 decades later called The Rage, Carrie 2, which honestly might be the first of the modern trend to do sequels to movies decades after they came out. There were 2 Broadway adaptations of this. Well, one Broadway, one off-Broadway adaptation. There was a made-for-TV movie version of this, and then there was a version in, I believe, 2012 of Carrie starring Chloe Grace Moretz. And in that version, they're much more clear that Carrie is only killing the bad people in the school and leaving sort of the good people alive.
The other one made people's brains hurt.
Yeah, this is by far. I think that the Chloe Grace Moretz version has a lot of interesting things to it. It also has a crap ton of terrible CGI. but this is very much the best version of the story.
Is
Um,
corn syrup really that expensive these days? I don't get it.
yeah, they actually do CGI blood at the end
Yeah,
for that
yeah,
one,
that's
and
the thing. It's like
it
is
looks horrible.
everybody does that nowadays? Like is fake blood really that hard to get
um,
that it's cheaper to pay a whole effects team to do it instead?
but yeah, in this version, Carrie is pretty indiscriminate about who she's killing. Like she's had it with all of these assholes, and she is going to kill them all.
Yeah, but that reaction is based on a perception that doesn't match up exactly with reality. That she feels, um, that's the thing is that for all the abuse that she endures, in that moment, Carrie feels like more of a victim than she really is. That she feels like everybody is against her. When it was really just three or four assholes.
Yeah, which I mean, obviously the key phrase is they're all gonna laugh at you. Um,
Yeah.
and I'm
Yeah,
not.
but that's only a horrible offense to carry.
Mhm,
I'm everybody else doesn't know what it was that was dropped on her.
mhm,
Um, B, a part of the impression that I got was that they were more laughing at the fact that Tommy got knocked out.
mhm. Yeah.
Um, because there is something sort of slapsticky to that.
Mhm,
Um, this is clearly, this is a kind of, um, shocked and amused action on everybody's part before they had time to grasp what actually happened.
yeah, and I think that part of
It's
Carrie's
done.
re I think part of Carrie's reaction is that we know as an audience member that Sue Snell and Tommy Ross genuinely wanted to do something nice for Carrie. Carrie
But
does
she,
not know that. Like for
yes,
all she
exactly.
knows, everyone set her up for this. When it was really just Chris and her boyfriend and the or Norma in her red hat and like just a couple other people.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that was sort of ultimately one of the main points of the movie is that you you never get diminishing returns on cruelty.
Mhm,
That if you show cruelty to somebody, they will pay it forward tenfold. They won't just get back at you.
mhm.
That what that abuse that you showed to them will eventually spill out of them in just in whatever direction is handy. Um, and so yeah, that's the thing is that it isn't really revenge exactly. It's more of a it's a psychotic break. She lashes out at everybody that she is in contact with.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. So since we're talking about the prank, what did you think of Chris?
was Chris the
Chris was the girl that planned the blood
girl?
prank.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I wasn't totally sure what to make of her because we're given a reason by the plot for why she's mad at Carrie.
Mhm,
That that because of in her mind because of Carrie she has to either do all this horrible gym detention or miss the prom. And but the degree of hatred that she develops for Carrie really doesn't seem to match up with that.
mhm,
It's again like everybody else. Everybody else is shitty to Carrie just because she's kind of there and doesn't, and that she won't respond that much
mhm.
because she's feels so powerless. Um, so everybody else just does it. It seems almost out of boredom in a
Mhm.
way. Um, whereas Chris has this vendetta that doesn't seem to match up with anything in reality. So I wasn't sure what to make of that, because the lengths to which she goes to, and to humiliate Carrie, in some ways seem almost as psychotic as what Carrie does in response to it.
Yeah, in the book, Chris is much more of just an outright sociopath. In the book, they make it very clear that that Carrie is not her only victim, but that she treats basically the entire bottom rung, sort of the high school social strata,
Mm-hmm.
in a similar manner, just not to the degree that she picks on Carrie.
Right.
And yeah, I think that she is kind of a sociopath in the movie. But then she's also in this really weird relationship with John Travolta's character, where he
Yeah.
keeps slapping her, and
But
it's
also seems to be totally like at her beck and call, and she's like, you have to help me take this elaborate revenge on this nerdy girl at school. And like, okay, blah, 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 blah.
yeah.
A brief story time. When it first cuts to them in the car, I legitimately thought that, for some reason, it was very late and I was very tired, so I didn't think about the time travel shenanigans that might be involved with this. But when it first cuts to them in the car, I legitimately thought for a solid minute or so that some character in the movie was watching Grease on TV.
Mm-hmm.
And we were seeing a clip of that, and it was then going to cut back the way that movies do to show who else was in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Because Travolta looks exactly the same.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so it was, I was like, man, I really don't remember. It's been a long time since I've seen Grease, and I really don't remember this scene. And it was eventually when it went on, as it kept going on and on, I was, oh no, wait, John Travolta's actually in this movie. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, this was one of his first roles, and interesting first role.
Yeah.
Particularly when she's giving him a blowjob in order to get him to agree to her revenge scheme.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
and there's the funniest line in the movie. Yes, when she's in the middle of giving him a blowjob, and he's like, oh, I really hate Carrie White.
Yeah. Chris, not exactly a stable character.
No.
And like,
But we're never given we're never shown, because yeah, if the story of this movie is the story of the bully to becoming the bully, we're never given a sense of where that comes from in Chris. That Chris is just evil. You know what I mean?
yeah.
And I wasn't sure how to feel about that. And I guess it would have been sort of obvious, I guess, if if the movie had sort of thrown in a perfunctory scene of, well, she comes from an abusive family too, blah blah blah. But I don't know. I felt like that element of the film was a little murky. And I wasn't quite sure how to feel about it.
Yeah, and I think that her revenge plot is taken to such a extreme, which makes thematic sense, but to literally go sneak into a pigsty, murder a pig, take all of its blood, and then use that, as opposed to just red paint or something like that.
Yeah, it's like it's not even about humiliation. It's like a ritual.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's like it's pig's blood because Chris has to know that it's actually pig's blood covering Carrie.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about making Carrie feel shitty, because Carrie has no way of knowing what it is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, she can probably smell that it's something organic.
Well, yeah. I'm sure she can tell it's blood, but yeah, the fact that it's this particularly horrible thing really does seem to benefit just Chris.
Mm-hmm.
That it's just so that Chris knows that that's what happened to her. Yeah, which is pretty insane. You know,
Yeah,
it's pretty psychotic.
yeah. Of course, she does get exploded in the end, so
Yeah. Um, yeah, pretty. Yes, a 70s car exploded, um,
hmm
which are the best explosions.
hmm yeah.
Which
So
and it's weird. It's weird that that's removed from. And I think that was a deliberate choice because this is what I was saying is I felt like the choice to have not just the mean kids die, but everybody at in the school die at the hands of Carrie. Um, is this sort of deliberate choice so that it doesn't feel like this kind of righteous revenge. And so I think it was an interesting and clearly very deliberate choice to have Chris and John Travolta um, die later. That it's after the massacre at the school, after Carrie walks out, um, to make sure that you don't get caught up in it.
yeah, and I
That
think that,
after seeing what you've just seen, you're not going to be able to be like, yeah, get him.
and I think that
You've
one
done
of
it
the more
before, like, yeah, fuck those two.
and one of the more interesting things about every version of the story is that Carrie never actually seeks them out. Like they're sort of just there, and she runs into them. And
Yeah,
again, they're being assholes to her because they're trying to run her down. I guess they have justification for this particular time, but like had they just driven the opposite direction from the school, they would have never run into her, and they would still be alive. Like she's not
yeah,
hunting them down.
yeah, and doesn't presumably doesn't know it was them.
hmm
I mean, I guess if she was if she could think clearly in the moment, she might have been able to deduce who it was, but that didn't really seem to be the state that she was in at the moment.
hmm
Um, so yeah, again, it takes great pains to make it clear that this isn't revenge, really. That this
hmm
is not, this is not a proportional response. That's not how abuse works.
hmm
That yeah, that it isn't centered on the people who did this to her. That they're destroyed sort of as an afterthought, as just as bystanders.
hmm
Um, Underneath this, they're just one of many other people drowned in this outpouring of all of this pent up rage.
hmm Yeah, and then of course after she explodes Chris and John Travolta, she goes back to her home and sort of regresses into childhood.
Yeah, yeah, and seems yeah, and it's really bizarre because the thing that she says to her mother is you were right, mother. They laughed at me.
hmm
Um, she doesn't she doesn't even seem fully aware exactly of what it is that she did.
hmm
Um, it's you could have cut out the whole massacre and that scene between her and her mother would have still made sense. You could have cut from her getting doused in pig's blood and everybody laughing at her, to her staggering back home, and you would have still been able to follow the interactions between her and her mother. It's like she's so uh, disconnected from her own actions, that she just hasn't even processed them.
Which, yeah, and again, she's looking for comfort, which is something that is consistently denied to Carrie throughout the entire movie, because
Yeah.
she looking for comfort and then gets stabbed with a butcher knife. Um,
Yep.
and then her mother tells a very bizarre story about how uh, she and her father, she and Carrie's father, had premarital sex, and then they agreed to never have sex again and then one night he got drunk, and then the degree to which what happened next is sort of consensual is up in the air. Um, but
Yeah.
her mom talks about how she enjoyed it. Um, and it's just an outpouring of psychosis from her mother, um, and about how she should have just murdered Carrie when Carrie was born.
Yeah, yeah, and again, and this brings it all back to sex, um, which the massacre doesn't really have anything to do with, but the finale certainly does because it's back to her mother,
Mm-hmm.
um, where all of that stems from, and yeah, it's hang on, I had a point, I'll remember it.
Yeah.
Uh, shit, it'll come back to me.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, it's sort of just well, it's obviously not something you would ever tell your child. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, and Carrie's mother really doesn't seem to have any understanding of, um, not even just of boundaries like that, of parental boundaries, but of social boundaries. She doesn't really seem to understand how to interact with anybody,
yeah.
like her daughter.
Hmm.
But what I was going to say, I remember, is that there's, at the root of um, all of her mother's fucked up feelings about sex, there's this sort of fundamental masochism that shows itself occasionally. And I think that's one of the strangest and, in a way, most compelling things about the very end of the movie, um, when Carrie is crucifying her mother. Um, with half a dozen butcher's knives or so, that every time uh, another one sticks into her, she makes this little moan, and it sounds almost like pleasure.
Yeah.
That
When
it's
it,
not a cry of pain. It's this sort of laugh, almost like ah, and it's really off-putting. And it's yeah, and just further sort of colors, it's and drives home just how horrible this relationship was from the start, and just how detached from reality this person is.
yeah, I mean, when they cut to her face, which that is a very dragged out death. And when they cut to her face, she looks like she's having an orgasm. Like her
Yeah,
eyes are, yeah, it's definitely not like I'm in pain being stabbed by multiple implements. Um, it's like she can only, her only ability to have a sexuality or enjoy sexuality is through this sort of,
it's by literally being killed.
yeah, like she can't just do it like I want to say like a normal person, but you can't do it like anyone. Like it has to be this sort of weird, abusive, as you said, masochistic version of sexuality. Um,
Yeah, and that sort of informs, and is probably at the root um, of the self-denial that she lived by.
mhm.
Um, that that she feels that her life should be suffering, not really out of a sense of moral duty, but because she craves suffering
Mhm.
uh, on a personal level. Um, and it just makes the life that Carrie has had feel even more unfair, because like you weren't even the victim of some kind of um, tragically misguided sense of genuine morality. um, that she was, that she was sort of constantly victimized by somebody else's fetish,
Yeah.
which just makes it even more sad because it was so. Because everything about Carrie's mother turns out to be ultimately just self-gratifying.
Hmm.
That because throughout the first part of the movie, it seems like there is this misguided concern that's actually there, that she actually does want to raise her daughter the right way. She just has a really poor grasp of what the right way to raise a human being is.
Hmm.
And I think her behavior in the finale, from her telling that story onwards, really calls that all into question. And the fact that she decides to kill her.
Hmm.
No, this isn't about her at all. This is all about you.
Yeah, which, again, the fact that she decides to kill Carrie isn't because Carrie just murdered, I don't even know how many people were at that prom. Um, it's completely unrelated to Carrie's actions. Like, this isn't
Exactly.
sort of Carrie's out of
That's why I was saying
control.
you could have put it out and the movie would have still made sense.
Yeah. Like, this is simply because of the fact that this is Margaret White
Yes.
has this fucked up notion of religion and of Carrie's role within her own life. That Carrie is the manifestation of Margaret White's own sin. And the only way to purge herself of that sin is to literally murder Carrie.
Yeah.
Um, which, like, even when Carrie is getting her ultimate comeuppance, I guess would be the best way to put it. Like, it's not about redemption, it's about more abuse being piled on top of her.
Yeah. Yeah. That right to the end. Even after even after the massacre at the school, that Carrie is still being abused by somebody.
Hmm.
That there's still somebody trying to put her under their foot.
Yeah. Which, and of course, she crucifies her mother, then she pulls her mother's corpse into the closet that she would get locked into and
Hmm.
literally causes the entire house to burst into fire and then implode and
Yeah, and
sink
then
underground.
into hell? Question mark? Maybe.
Yeah. Well,
I don't know.
does Carrie White burn in hell?
That's the question.
Hmm.
Uh, and I don't think Stephen King will answer it if we ask it.
Yeah. Hmm. Um,
Um,
I think that is sort of an evocative or a very interesting image to sort of leave us with. Um, the cross
yeah, I
that
wonder who
says,
did it.
hmm.
Who put that message there?
Hmm.
Um, because Chris is dead. Um,
Hmm.
Apparently, apparently everybody in the school who saw what happened,
Hmm.
it's dead. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, who the fuck wrote that?
Hmm.
Is the weird thing that and that's a weird idea to leave us with, that um even the little bit of this world that we saw, almost all of which was against Carrie, didn't even begin to cover how much the world was against Carrie.
Hmm.
That
Like,
there are people you know who hate Carrie White that we will never see,
hmm.
that we will never even know about.
Hmm. That even in death, Carrie has no peace. That she
Yeah.
still has to be this object of scorn. That she still has to be sort of, and like that just seems to be just pointing out how tragic sort of the story is.
Yeah. Yeah, that it's yeah, she she died like she lived, being abused for no real reason.
Yeah.
Um,
Like you just,
yeah, that's pretty rough.
yeah. Like I said, there's a version of the story where Carrie emerges sort of triumphant, which was actually sort of the made-for-TV version where Carrie lives at the end. Um,
That makes sense.
yeah, which Carrie and Sue Snell drive off into the sunset basically to go on
Sweet.
adventures together.
Awesome.
Yeah. Um,
So that's because I was thinking, I was watching it, I was like, the other like less fucked up version of this is Life is Strange.
mhm,
Um, and one of the possible endings of Life is Strange is kind of like that.
mhm.
That sounds about right. You
Yeah.
wanted you wanted to do this story, but not make anybody too uncomfortable.
Yeah. I think.
That way.
Yeah. I think it's like it's asking us as a movie. It's asking us to both be deeply sympathetic to Carrie, but also deeply unsympathetic to Carrie because either way, it's really fucked up because either you're being unsympathetic towards a girl who literally everyone in the movie, with the exception of like three characters, treats as human garbage, or you're
Or
sort
you're being
of,
murderer.
yeah, to a mass murderer, a
Yeah.
person who kills dozens of people. Um,
Yeah, and I think it's not supposed to be as simple as one or the other.
mhm,
Um, that you're supposed to that if you're going to feel anything um, other than Carrie, that you should be afraid of her.
mhm,
Uh, rather than hating her.
mhm,
You should be frightened and sad that that people like Carrie exist.
yeah,
That the world produces people like that. Um,
mhm,
whereas because you can't hate her because again, it's not like what she does isn't her fault, but it's um, she's not she's her identity is not the product of her own actions
mhm.
up to that.
Yeah, I
Um,
think that it reminds me a bit of, there's an autobiographical graphic novel that's going to be a movie pretty soon, called My Friend Dahmer, which is about a guy who was friends with Jeffrey Dahmer growing up, and sort of him working through sort of his emotions towards, he knew about sort of all these things that happened to Jeffrey Dahmer, but also Jeffrey Dahmer is a psychotic monster who murdered so many people,
yeah,
um, and like in which eventually comes to the conclusion that, well, yeah, he basically ceases to have any sympathy for Jeffrey Dahmer once he starts to kill people. But that doesn't necessarily preclude the fact that there was a whole bunch of other stuff that happened before then, um, that contributed to who he was, that how he became the kind of person that would murder people. And I think that's very true of Carrie, is that we're seeing sort of all these things that sort of add up to a mass murderer, um, and we're challenged about sort of how do we come to grips with the fact that Carrie did not just spontaneously appear out of nowhere, murder a whole bunch of people, and then vanish like Jason.
yeah, and again, I think that comes back to what I was saying earlier about Catcher in the Rye, that um, that in a way you don't have to look at Carrie and think, okay, do I sympathize with this person or not sympathize with them, or do I condone or not condone what they do? That it's more about it's more about the point that is being made by um, bringing up the fact that this happens.
Mhm.
That it's, it's sort of, on its most basic level, it's sort of a morality tale,
Mhm.
or a cautionary tale, that it's, don't treat people this way, because
Mhm.
it doesn't, it'll um, eventually come back to haunt somebody, even if
Yeah.
it isn't you. Um, so I think it's, I think, maybe it's sort of a cop out, but I think the easiest way to view it is to just sort of take a broader view of the story and say, um, it is, um, it is a terrible and horrifying and abhorrent thing that this happened, and
Yeah.
that leaving out how you feel about any of the characters involved. Because again, um, if we are to say that parts of Carrie's character are sympathetic, but we didn't say anything like that earlier when we were talking about Chris.
Mhm.
Uh, that Chris is almost entirely unsympathetic, but we don't really know anything about Chris. For all we know, this person that Chris is and the bad things that she does to people, might have been born out of not too dissimilar circumstances. We don't
Mhm.
really know. Um, so I think the question sort of goes, or rather, I think the discussion sort of goes beyond the question of whether Carrie is defensible as a person outside of her actions, if that even means anything. Um, that the more pressing matter is just the tragedy of the events themselves,
Yeah.
um, rather than Carrie's actions and whether the motivations behind them are justifiable or not, or anything like that.
Yeah. I think that's pretty much what the movie leaves us with. Um, all right, so let's get to our final segment, best death. So, who do you think had the best death in this movie?
Ooh, I don't know, because um, most of the deaths aren't terribly entertaining, with the exception uh, of Chris and John Travolta's death. Um, so since we can't really use that as a metric, I guess I'll say Margaret White, um, 'cause that's the death that is made the most of, and has the most thematic resonance. It's the most interesting from a filmmaking perspective. So I'll go with that one. I'll go with Margaret White.
I think I'm going to go with Carrie's own death of literally pulling the house into her torture closet, basically, and then sinking it underground. Um,
That's rough to beat.
I think that's pretty rough death and pretty spectacular too. All right, well, thank you to all of our listeners who are stopped by, and we'll be back next week. Bye.
See you around, folks.